Thanks everyone for joining. Thanks to my panelists for making time to spend this hour with me to talk about how we can improve manuscript transfers for authors. This is a webinar that's being recorded, and we make the slides available afterwards on the Chronosub website, so you don't have to take too many notes if you want to look back and check some things. So my name's Romy Beard. I'm the head of publisher relations here at Chronosub, an open access management platform for publishers, institutions, and funders. And I'm joined by my three panelists today. We've got James Butcher, the founder of Journalology. I hope I pronounced that correctly, James. Melissa Patterson, Director of Editorial Development at AIP Publishing, and Catherine Goodman from the American Chemical Society. So as you're still all joining us, just going to run really quickly through the format. I'm going to do a very short introduction on the topic of where manuscript transfers, and then I'll hand over to James and then Melissa and Catherine, who will each give us a 5-minute short presentation on their organization and some of their involvement with article transfers and the problems and solutions they might have found. And after that, we'll dig into the discussion. I've got a number of topics prepared that we'll talk about, but this is quite interactive. So if you have any questions for our panelists or for us as a group, then please put them in the Q&A. And also, if you have any comments in general, if you want to chat amongst yourselves, feel free to use the chat for that. I think numbers are pretty stable now. Thanks everyone for joining. It's been really great seeing so many of you online. So, as I said, I'll do a quick introduction. So the topic today is manuscript transfers. And I know some people on the call, they actually asked me in advance, it's like, I don't really know what this is about, but I'll join. I'd like to learn more. So this is specific to journal publishing and not so much for book publishing. And what happens is if a journal has been offered the option to transfer their original manuscript from one journal to another journal. And this is often labeled as reject with transfer decision within the peer review system, the submission system. And this can happen at the editorial review stage, so before peer review or after peer review. And I've put here to say that it tends to happen between journals by the same publisher, although we'll talk about some examples as well where it happens across publishers, and something to dig into in the discussion. So why are authors offered a transfer? It's primarily for two reasons: quality and scope. If their original manuscript doesn't quite match the journal they've submitted to, or it's slightly out of scope, they might have been offered a transfer. So about a year ago, I didn't know very much about transfers at all, and it came up in various discussions with publishers. So I've done a little bit of research. So this is what I really found out when I dug into, well, how do transfers happen? What's the procedure? What are the problems with it? And I came across two different routes. One that I called the publisher-driven route, which seems to be the more traditional way to do manuscript transfers, which is when the author is offered a transfer to one or more specific journals by the publisher. And I'm using the term publisher here to really mean anyone who works for the publishing organizations. Obviously, it could be an editor, not necessarily the one who carries the role of the publisher. And the author then accepts and completes the transfer, and that usually happens within the peer review system. Now, the other thing I've come across is the more author-driven route to transfers, where the publishing organization labels the manuscript as reject with transfer, but it's not them making the decision on where they suggest the article to go. So it's then the author who, maybe with the help of another tool, for example, I've come across the Sage Journal Recommender or the people at the Springer Nature Transfer Desk, who might then help the author to make a decision where they want to transfer their manuscript to. So more of an author-driven transfer initiation. And I've found some examples where then there's another step where the editor or someone at the journal needs to accept that request before it is authorized. So I'd hope we talk a little bit about that as well, and what could it look like without editorial involvement. Now, the challenges that I've come across with journal transfer is, in some cases, determining the destination journal. If editors don't know which other journals they should be suggesting and what is the best journal to suggest, where this manuscript has the best chance of getting published. Understand that might be less of an issue for smaller publishers, or if there's a very specific cascade workflow in place. Then there's obviously technical aspects of the actual transfer, transferring the metadata, transferring the reviewer comments, and the cases where an author might want to do changes to their manuscript before it goes to the new journal. And I think a lot of those changes seem to lead to really the issue with the author not proceeding with the transfer, because there seems to be the recognition that there are issues with the process, frustration, and might lead to another rejection, for example. And also being cumbersome of having to redo the submission almost. I find some cases where the author really has to just do a new submission. In other cases, they complete what's missing because there's differences between the different submission forms as well. And one question I wondered is if one of the issues is that the author's worried that they might get rejected again. Is there more information about the destination journal that we could provide to authors to make that process easier? So I found some author concern. I had a little look at Twitter and some other places, and they seem to fall into two groups. One is the frustration at it being time-consuming, inefficient, leading to another rejection. As this first one here, Dr. Mary says, I got no writing done today. The other concerns that I've picked up on, which I've heard from libraries as well, is the concern that there's a transfer offered to a sister journal that charges an APC, and that the author wasn't really informed about that and they need to come up with the money. So that seems to be something that comes up as well. So I hope we can get into some of those in the discussion later, but that's everything for the introduction from me. So I'll hand over to James.
Thank you very much. Really nice to be here with you all. I'm going to spend a few minutes thinking about some of the more publishing commercial aspects, just simply because I think it's important to try and get a sense of why transfer cascades have been a thing over the last decade or so. So yeah, if we could just move forward to the first slide. So this is a gross simplification and generalization, and it isn't really this simple. But I want to try and explain, if I can, why publishers have started creating transfer cascades, and particularly with the transition to open access. And as I say here, the key thing is all about the fact that the revenue per published article for many publishers, not all publishers, but for many publishers, under an open access business model falls. So this is all purely theoretical. I put some numbers here just to make the explanation easier. But under a traditional model, which had an institutional subscription model, so libraries pay to access the content, for some journals, and this isn't just commercial publishers, this could be society publishers too, if you took the total institutional subscription revenue from all of the institutions and divided it by the number of articles that the journal published, you're probably going to get quite a high number, and it could be, let's say, $8,000 per article. For some journals, for clinical journals, it will be a lot higher than that, often, not always, but sometimes. So under a subscription model, an institutional subscription model, publishers can be generating much more than under an open access model. So if a journal flips to 100% open access, they're probably not going to be able to charge $8,000 for an APC, which means that, and let's say that they choose 4,000, and this is, as I say, just hypothetical numbers. But effectively, what that would mean to generate the same amount of revenue, a publisher needs to publish twice as many articles to make the same revenue. But crucially, they're also going to end up with more costs because you're publishing twice as many papers, so you're going to have more costs, so your margin will decrease. So this is what a lot of publishers are facing, is that maybe they've got a flagship or a couple of flagship journals. They don't, if they flip to open access, there's going to be a revenue shortfall. And this isn't about profit margins. This is about more than profit margins, i.e. the journal could become loss leading. So how do you create a portfolio strategy that allows publishers to try and transition to open access? And one way to do that is through transfer cascades. So we can move on to the next slide. And I've used this one as an example just because I know it. There's lots of other examples across the board with different publishers doing it. So for those of you who don't know my background, I spent 15 years working first at Nature Publishing Group and then Springer Nature, and was responsible for the Nature journals. And this is a schematic that was produced by a couple of academics and published in Learned Publishing in 2021. It's not a million miles away from the truth of how things are done within the Nature portfolio. So you have Nature and Nature research journals with acceptance rates of about 10%, Nature Communications, the communications journals and scientific reports, at which are open access journals with higher acceptance rates. And the idea being that authors can choose whereabouts in the portfolio they want to submit. So some may choose go to Nature and get rejected and end up in one of the research journals, or just go down this transfer cascade. So the idea is, and I genuinely think this is, this can work for both parties. So yes, it helps publishers with transitions to open access and broadening their portfolio, but it also helps to authors because it means that if it's done well, an author will be able to find a home somewhere within the portfolio for their papers. So, and crucially, it allows you potentially to protect the selectivity of some of the journals at the top of the transfer pyramid. So, over time, perhaps they're making less money than they used to under a subscription model, but the overall pyramid means that the transfer cascade works. So that's just one example, and there are lots and lots and lots of other examples. Society publishers, commercial publishers have created similar kinds of things to this. Not all portfolio strategies are as deep as this one, but lots of publishers are trying to do a similar kind of thing. So if we go on to the final slide, I just wanted to just think a little bit, particularly about the editorial KPIs. So, if any transfer cascade, one of the things that you need to be thinking about is it working? Are we getting it to authors to the right home for the right papers? And so here are some of the KPIs, and I won't read them all here, but a lot of it's just about how many papers you can almost do it on a piece of paper and sketch it out in terms of, if you've got 100 papers coming into the funnel at the top, where do they end up? How good is your transfer cascade? But most importantly, right at the bottom here, author satisfaction. Authors are always in charge of their papers. It's their paper. They get to decide what to do. Publishers don't dictate to them. They can walk away. And obviously, in order to do a good job, you need to provide good author satisfaction. And one way of measuring that is, do they come back to you with repeat business? So measuring KPIs is really important. These are some examples. A lot of it will be for editors, trying to measure how the editorial teams are doing. And we can talk a little bit more in the discussion section. But that's all I wanted to say for now. I'm going to hand over, I think, to Melissa.
Thank you. And thank you, Romy, for organizing this. So I'm Melissa Patterson. I'm the Director of Editorial Development. I oversee sort of the content development and journal strategy of our portfolio. So my perspective on manuscript transfer is very much geared towards the editorial side. So you can go to the first slide, Romy. Thank you. So first, I wanted to start with just an overview of what our transfer program entails and the philosophy which we have, which is essentially finding a home. Authors have already chosen us, and our goal is to help them make their work better through the peer review process, find a place to publish it in the journal that it's submitted to, or within another journal in our portfolio. And how we've been trying to communicate this to our editors and internally to our staff is what I have written on the right-hand side there, which is a little aspirational, but not too far off from what I think we should be striving for, which is that we envision a collaborative and unified portfolio working together in service of our authors' best interests. And so, what does this look like within our publishing program? Well, it needs to be easy and seamless. So if a paper, a manuscript is recommended for transfer, all of the information, the article information, is automatically sent to the transferring journal, inclusive of its reviews. We encourage and enable the editors within our peer review system to collaborate with one another so they can make the best possible offer to an author. So that could be something like guaranteeing peer review. So within that letter, you can say if you transfer, it will go on to peer review. If that paper was editorially rejected at the parent, or a provisional acceptance. And at AIP Publishing, editors have the ability to directly accept papers in some of our journals, specifically our broad scope open access journal, AIP Advances. And so can you go to the next slide for me? So we focus primarily a lot of our efforts on editor engagement. And I know we do think about author experience, and I'll talk a little bit about that in our next slide, but we find that the more we listen and respond to the thoughts and feedbacks of the editors within the transfer mechanism, the more likely they're going to give the author the best experience and direct those papers to journals where they might actually find a final publication home. So what we've done is we've had an advisory board that feeds into the process and provides constant feedback on how we might improve the program. We regularly attend associate editor meetings across all of our journals to connect and answer questions on the process. We provide a lot of education on scope. This is one of the biggest challenges, making sure that editors are aware of how to topically direct papers upon transfer. And we offer ongoing training, modules for both current and new editors on the transfer workflow, our philosophy, and any changes that might need to be made to help enable them to make good recommendations to other journals in our portfolio. Next slide, Romy. And so what we're working on now is the focus on author experience, ensuring that we can empower our authors through author-initiated transfers. We have not started this, and Romy gave a nice overview of publisher-directed versus author-directed. And so we're going to create some mechanisms where an author can say upon submission, if I'm not accepted in this journal, I would really like to be considered for this other journal, and make that happen for them if the rejection does come through. We want to think about reducing friction across journals. Journals are they have their idiosyncrasies, they have different formatting requirements, length limits. So to the extent with which we can streamline those requirements so authors don't have to do a ton of work to get papers transferred to a new journal, that is something that we're focusing on this year. And then I think Romy touched on this, which is double rejection. I think this is, it's unavoidable. I think we can try to reduce it as much as possible, and we should try to reduce it. But one thing we should aim to do, because I think feedback that we've gotten from researchers is that the lack of a comprehensive explanation as to why a paper is being rejected is what makes it a poor experience. So to the extent with which we can inform and educate and give good feedback to the authors, if they experience a double rejection, that's what we need to focus on with our editors. And so this is just a brief overview of what we're doing. And I think I'm going to hand it over to Catherine now.
Perfect. Thank you so much. As Romy mentioned, I'm Catherine Goodman. I'm a senior associate publisher at ACS. And my comments, if you want to advance to the next slide, are going to echo a lot of what you just heard from Melissa. So to give you a flavor of what we're up to at ACS, we have a portfolio of about 85 journals, and that covers things that are very broad in scope and meant to be high impact and relevant to the broader chemistry audience like JACS. We have more topically focused journals that where you get into some of those questions of scope and what fits where. We have some unusual challenges where we have, like accounts of chemical research, which is unique because it's almost entirely invited content. It uses a special format that is not always available at every journal. We have the letters journals represented here by macro letters, and so that can create challenges if, like, JACS wants to transfer an article to macro letters. Do you ask the reviewers to review a manuscript that's much longer than what they normally sign up for on a reduced timeline, or do you ask the authors to reformat? Those kinds of complications. And then we have our Sound Science journal, Omega. Despite the challenges that I mentioned, we do have an extensive network of transfer pathways that do connect, overlapping scopes. And, like with the letters journals, they might be more likely to want to be in each other's pathways because that format is consistent. And we do, based on Romy's terminology earlier, we use the publisher-driven model. So editors can offer either a single destination to their authors or up to 3 using author selects, which is available at a handful of our journals. Next slide, please. Again, to mirror Melissa's talk, kind of our overview or philosophy is that this is really meant to be an author service. By submitting to ACS, we feel like authors are telling us they want to publish with ACS. They're excited about being part of the ACS community, and so we want to find a home for them. Moreover, our editors and referees are investing time in improving the paper. And so kind of as a complement or secondary factor to the kind of business aspect that James was talking about earlier, we feel like, if we're investing the time to make the paper better, especially where authors can't at the moment take those reviews with them if they leave our system, then we want to help them towards publication as soon as possible. So we do both in onboarding and in training editors, in ongoing training, encourage editors to really help authors find the right home for them, even if it's not their journal. As again, Melissa said, the editors can consult across journals. So if they're not sure if an article is a good fit for a journal, they can do kind of a quick scope check. There are also some more detailed pilots going on where editors can ask their fellow colleagues for more extensive input about, what could you promise to these authors? Again, like Melissa said, a provisional accept, or I promise to send it out to peer review, that kind of thing, to help avoid the authors feeling like they're bouncing around. And as most publishers, we have a lot of tools and metrics that we use to guide editors and encourage them to make good recommendations. So if a journal feels like they're getting a lot of transfers in that don't fit the scope of the journal, they might create some documentation that they can share more broadly with their colleagues to try and cut down on the things that aren't going to be a good fit. We can look at rejected articles and see, gosh, there's a community overlap here that we didn't know about. And so that can create new pathways, that kind of thing. And of course, AI tools that can help editors think about journals they might not have been aware of. We also have a terrific team of development editors who do several things around the division, but one of their most critical functions is that they know our portfolio inside and out. So they can not only use the same tools and guidance that is available to our editors, but they can take the time to, even investigate an author's past history. If there are two journals that are very similar, they can see, gosh, this author really likes to publish in journal A. Let's make that recommendation rather than journal B, even if the scopes are overlapping. Next slide, please. So just to highlight a few things that I think are probably global challenges, but were top of mind for me. At ACS, we have almost 900 now, I think, editors-in-chief, associate editors, people who are making decisions on manuscripts. And they have term limits, so there's always some flux among that crowd. Plus, there's all the scientific, shifts and priorities and advances that might change what a journal wants to focus on or wants to prioritize. So just kind of, keeping on top of that shifting sand for all the personnel and science, and keeping lines of communication open is always a challenge. In the middle here, we have, like I said, we have a lot of information about what might be a really good home for that paper. And of course, that may not be what authors have in mind. So again, it is totally their paper. They have full autonomy. And so, they may, from our perspective, miss out on a good outcome because they have a different agenda. And then kind of the just bigger challenge, I think, of, each journal is editorially independent, and we bring on editors to work at a journal, not for ACS, and they, have a mandate to safeguard the science of their community. But we also want to have these broader portfolio goals. So how do we kind of balance those two tensions is just an ongoing issue. So I'll stop there and turn it back to you, Romy.
Thank you so much, everyone, and thanks for sticking to your times. That's amazing. Always a challenge. So I'm going to stop the sharing just now so I can look at all the questions. We've got a couple of questions online, so I think we'll start with some of those before we'll go into the ones we prepared. There was one question to you, Melissa, that I think has disappeared again already. Maybe you did answer it, about how you do your engagement with editors. Do you want to speak a little bit about that?
Sure, and I just answered to Mallory. Thanks for asking that question. So there is that, Catherine also talked about that consultation feature within our peer review system, but we also do sort of deliberate topical meetings with editors across journals where the scopes might overlap, so they can have a conversation around, oh, this is a topic that we might be interested in. If you have a paper that comes in and you want to transfer it, we'd be willing to accept it. And I think her follow-up question was around cascades and how that's set up. We're actually trying to move away from a cascade structure, and even that language to sort of say that there's one at the very top, sort of like the pyramid that James showed. We're looking for more of a lateral way of transferring papers, and the perception of one journal being better than another because of the impact factor being higher. And so we want to make the best decision for a paper. So we've had instances where a paper has been submitted to a journal and it would be published in that receiving journal, but might be a better fit because topically it's more focused for another journal, and it's been transferred because that was the best decision for that paper. And for that author. Now, that doesn't happen very often because editors don't like to give up good papers, but that's sort of the culture that we're trying to create within our portfolio.
And you've talked, and so has Catherine, a little bit about, authors being in charge and, having their own agenda sometimes. Do you see the possibility for transfers to work with less editorial involvement, or do you feel that's crucial to making it a success?
Maybe I could just echo what Melissa was saying. The challenge that I was pointing out of authors kind of having their own agenda, often what we find they want to do is go down that cascade, what we call impact factor shopping, where they want to just go down to the journal that has the next highest impact factor. And often those author initiated transfers are unsuccessful. So ACS actually did at one point have an author kind of enabled transfer feature, and it just was not working as successfully as our editor guided one is. That's not to say that there shouldn't or couldn't be a future there, but I think Melissa's right that there needs to be a movement away from just thinking that the higher impact factor is necessarily the best.
Yeah, and that's obviously an industry-wide movement to try and move away from that. But I think authors, from what I hear, still look at that quite a lot in making their decisions. So what other metrics could we provide to authors to help them make a decision, or help consider a journal that maybe on an impact factor ranking doesn't look as good and they would not want to accept the transfer in that route? I know there was a question earlier that I think James answered about information about how many journals that have gone down the transfer route with a particular journal have been accepted. Are those metrics we could make available to authors?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know of publishers that are sharing that. I mean, maybe you guys are and I'm just not aware of it, but I don't think many publishers share their statistics around their transfers. And I suspect, although I don't have any firm evidence, that it will vary quite a lot between different publishers, depending on how they do things and how their portfolio is set up. I mean, authors shouldn't care about impact factor, but the sad truth is they do. And they also often misjudge where the best home for their paper might be. And I think this is where, coming back to what Catherine was saying, why getting the editors involved is so helpful, because if you have a joined up team of editors, which is easier said than done, but if everyone understands where the editorial bar is across the different journals, collectively you can guide the authors to the right home, rather than leaving it up to them to decide where they think it might end up. And that's where I think a lot of the frustration and the time spent being rejected, re-reviewing, go somewhere else, it could be the same publisher, it could be a different publisher, is just, authors often misunderstand where their paper might best be placed. And it's trying to help them to do that as quickly as possible, because most papers are publishable, probably. If they're technically sound, they should be publishable. It's just a question of where.
So are you suggesting that if there was better guidance for authors, what would be a realistic home for their journal before they even submit in the first place, that might take some of those challenges away?
Yeah, I mean, what you could do potentially is submit to the portfolio rather than to a particular journal. Now, that's not necessarily very popular with the editors and may not be very popular with the authors, but that's, I mean, Cell Press are doing something similar in their community review process, where the editors are helping the authors try and find the right place. Because whether we like it or not, the way that things are currently set up with impact factors and selectivity, to some degree, it's about trying to find the right level for a paper. You know, is this a paper that has broad relevance, that's cutting edge, that a huge community want to read? Great. Well, it may be more suitable for a general journal. If it's important, but speaks to a niche community using very specific methods that only that community uses, then it may be better in a more niche journal. I mean, I'm paraphrasing to try and get the point across, but editors are well placed to help authors make that decision or find the right home for their paper.
And I think there's some other studies from other publishers that have shown that transfers are most successful when, the offer letter, and it's in a personal way that comes directly from the editor, the author is more likely to accept it. And now something I wanted to talk a little bit about is the language that is being used. Like I said, in the research that I've done, I've come across the term reject with transfer most consistently. There's a little bit deviation. Do you both use that terminology, or the three of you, have you come across a more positive way that might be phrased for authors? Obviously, if it's a provisional accept, then that would change things, but does a reject with transfer feel like a rejection, or does it feel better for the author? Or can we make it feel better?
Yeah, we're currently reviewing all of those related letter templates and thinking about how we can make it clearer to the author that we're not saying your paper is a failure or that you are a failure. It's not meant to be just a straight reject, but really that we found a better home for your paper and we think this is it. The one trick comes back to, unless you have done a pretty extensive consultation, offering a firm a firm statement of what the downstream journal will do can be pretty fraught with, they may make their own choice and it may not be what the upstream journal thought. So that becomes tricky as well.
So Catherine, I mean, if I can just ask you a question there.
Of course.
So if you're, we should be caring, I would argue, most about what's best for authors. What you've just described really is about editorial independence, right? It's about different journals being able to make their own decisions.
Sure.
Should that trump? So should editorial independence trump what is best for authors? Do you see where I'm getting at in terms of?
I do. I think it's a super tricky question. I mean,
I like
that's
super
the
tricky
$1 million
questions,
question,
when I'm
right?
not the one who
Like,
has to answer them.
I mean, I think editors spend a huge amount of time thinking about their journal and their community. And so I think if you had, I think as you pointed out, or Melissa pointed out, like getting all these editors kind of in sync to really clearly understand what the scope of each other's journals are, what the standards are in that field, for example, if an editor at JAX who's kind of adjacent to the field, but is the best placed person to handle a particular manuscript thinks, oh, well, topically, this is perfect for that journal. But if they're not right in the field, they might not know there are some major, control experiments missing here or something. So if the editors at the downstream journal don't have the opportunity to really make sure the article is to their standards and to the community standards, not that they're imposing an artificially strict bar, but they have to do their due diligence as well. They're the protectors of that journal. So it's super tricky. Melissa, please I'm sure you have thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I do have thoughts on that. And I understand your perspective. And I like to push on this gatekeeping perspective, like point of view that a lot of the editors have, and a lot of subjectivity around perceived significance and quality thresholds. And now in our portfolio is a little flatter by way of impact factor. And so it's a little bit easier to talk about doing what's best for the author when it isn't this big leap in perceived quality. But I challenge the editors frequently to think about, are you putting an arbitrary quality threshold on a paper? If it is standards for a community and what is required to make that research useful and utilized and reproduced in the field, absolutely. But there are instances, probably more instances than we would like, where it's just, I think this paper is really boring, or I don't know this author. And so I think that there's also that I like to look out for our author's best interests. And someone also commented, is every paper publishable? No, absolutely not. I think that we do need to trust our editors to say this just needs to be rejected, is adding no value to the literature. But I think that I do like to push the boundaries a little bit on what perceived significance and quality is. And while maintaining the editor's independence, editorial independence, say, should we really be rejecting these papers, or is there value and rigor and quality here? And can you send it out to review and ultimately get it published?
Yeah, I'll yes, and one of your comments about if someone's rejecting a paper based on, I don't know this person, there's no place for that. We have a lot of training that we do and ongoing discussions with our editors about how to be aware of and avoid implicit bias. And hopefully that is translating into avoiding explicit bias as well. But yeah, there's absolutely no place for that.
Another thing perhaps to jump into now is what I've indicated in the introduction about transfers across publishers, because primarily intent is to keep the manuscript within one organization and keep it from being published with the competition in some cases. I have come across an interesting example of the manuscript transfer network between one journal from the Company of Biologists, Rockefeller University Press, and the American Society for Cell Biology, who allowed transfers between the 3 different journals without editorial discussion in advance, and also across 3 different peer review systems, which is amazing, using the MACA approach, which is quite amazing. So that led me into the question to you, Melissa, given the recent announcement about the purpose-led publishing and the kind of coalition between IOP, AIP, and APS, do you envisage transfers across the 3 physics publishers to be something that might happen in the future?
I love that you're asking this question, because I know 2 of my colleagues that I'm going to see next week from these publishing houses are on the webinar. And so I think that I think that it's an open question. I think that, the coalition is really rooted in, like-minded society publishers coming together to really reinforce that, our purpose is to serve the research community, specifically in physics, and to the extent with which we can collaborate with one another, to make it so that we have policies that are in alignment, and author resources, that we will do that. The question about transfers, and I can just speak for myself, is do I think we're going to get to a point where in rejection letters, I'm specifically making a recommendation to another publication in APS's portfolio, IOPP's portfolio? I don't know. Can we do some of these friction checks where maybe we align or standardize our formats, and so that it's easier? Can we package up reviews if an author does want to transfer to another journal in one of their in their portfolios? Maybe. I mean, I think that would be a worthwhile thing to pursue, but we haven't even started those conversations yet. But I think that it certainly is going to be something that will be asked, I'm sure.
Yeah, and I think you touched on an important subject there. We haven't talked about that much about the peer review. One of the issues is that obviously there's time pressure on peer reviews and not enough peer reviews out there, and being able to carry the peer review over between those transfers, or perhaps also in general portable peer review, would address some of those problems. And I can see that starting that on a small scale within a coalition like yourselves would be a way to test that, rather than making it all portable to anybody to take anywhere else.
I think part of the problem, though, is the plumbing. And what I mean by that is, the various different manuscript tracking systems that different publishers use that have different forms set up in a different way. So in my experience, when you're trying to transfer between publishers, it ends up being quite a manual process. And if it's a manual process involving people, that means it's expensive generally, which is everything that everyone's trying to, move away from. So if we could end up with more, easier transfers between publishers off the back of everyone set up their systems in a common way. I mean, that's idealistic, I would argue, but that's the ideal. But publishers also need to be willing to properly do what's best for their authors, right? I mean, that's in terms of making it possible for authors to go to other publishers if that's what they want to do. But of course, there's so many journals and so many different choices. Who's to say what the best option is across multiple publishers? It's hard enough within one portfolio half the time to decide where to push a paper. But the plumbing is a significant problem.
And I think there was the standard Mecca that, I think is used in the example that I mentioned. But like you said, there's so many differences in even just the submission forms. Even if everyone used that standard and you can transfer over, I think authors will still then need to go and complete additional questions. And that's perhaps a discussion as well. Say, well, are we asking too much from publishers, from authors at submission? Can everyone scale submission questions down and then only at acceptance ask some additional subject classification questions or additional questions? But yeah, I hear what you're saying on the format side, James.
I know one of the early entries into this cross-publisher experiment was the neurobiology community. I think they now have about 60 journals that do allow these cross-publisher transfers. And so, I have not been deeply embedded in the neurobiology field, but it would be interesting to come back to them and see, I don't know if it's 10 or 15 or 20 years on, what lessons have they learned and how do they deal with these plumbing issues? Surely there's
I'd be
folks
interested in the volumes as well. Are we talking about
sure
200 papers or 20,000 papers? I suspect it's more the former than the latter, but I don't know.
Yeah.
I may well be wrong.
Yeah, the needs to have a streamlined system if it's 200 papers is definitely pretty minimal. So yeah.
Let's look at some of the questions that we've received online in the Q&A. I know there's quite a lot of comments as well there in the chat. There's one question about whether anyone still pays per submission. If yes, there is more motivation to successfully transfer papers? Do you set KPIs for successful transfers?
I think there are some publishers that do take submission fees. My limited understanding for the few that I know of, they don't. Obviously, if you transfer, you don't have to pay twice. You pay the submission fee for the portfolio rather than for the journal. Most publishers don't do it. A lot of it is because when you're in a competitive space against other publishers, it's just a way of not getting papers. And when everyone wants submissions, you want to try and get submissions through the door. Putting in a submission fee makes things difficult. I mean, I've done lots of modeling over the years with submission fees as a way of trying to reduce the open access fees. I personally don't think it makes a huge difference. There's lots of admin burden. If someone pays, if authors paid, I'm making the numbers up, say $100, $200 to then get a desk reject within 48 hours is a hard sell. So I think most people don't like the idea of submission fees. On the other hand, the eLife model where effectively you're not paying for an APC for a publication, but you're paying for the service of being peer reviewed. I quite like that model. I think that's more of a editorial service model where you may, well, with eLife, everyone gets published if they want to, but that sense of peer review and editorial review as a service, that I can get more on board with. Submission fees, I think not many publishers do it. And those that do probably have so many submissions that it's a way of preventing some of the dross coming in.
Would it solve the paper mill issue? Probably not.
Maybe to some degree, but probably not.
Yeah. And what are your thoughts, everyone, on, say, the accusation from authors and in some case libraries that some publishers offer transfers just to an OA journal so they can charge an APC?
So I'll say, our ACS Omega is a fully gold open access. There is an APC. We make that extremely clear in our decision letters so people know what they're opting into if they choose to go that route. Of course, with lots of, funder read and publish agreements, many people can publish there effectively for free. But I think it kind of comes back to not only some of the comments that James made earlier, but kind of the whole open access environment of, if we're preparing ourselves for a future in which everything goes open access, we need to have established journals that people feel confident about that serve that community. So that's also, ACS launched a whole series of fully open access journals as well that cover different topics to help provide a home for people who do have those mandates, or just, would like to publish open access. So I think the transparency is critical, but I don't think it's not motivated just from a money grab.
And I think it goes, and obviously, I'm generalizing here, right? Just based on the comments that I picked up, and I know that doesn't go for all publishers, and in most cases, it really should be a very different decision. Whoever suggests to do the transfer and whoever has full visibility of APCs or can make a decision about waivers and discounts should not be the same people. But it's something that I've picked up in some conversations, and I agree with you. I think the main thing is transparency. I think if authors feel like, oh, you just made me go there, so I pay, but if it's really clear up front, and same goes for at submission, if they know if you're submitting here, yes, you're part of an agreement, you don't need to pay, or you might get a 50% discount, if they know that in advance. And I think that can go a long way in making things easier for authors as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's transformative agreements that makes things different. If we park transformative agreements for one moment and just think about a standard transfer cascade. So I'm not so much thinking about Melissa's horizontal transfer cascade, but a top to bottom. Normally journals towards the bottom of the pyramid are cheaper than the journals at the top. So if you're going down, you're probably being offered a cheaper option than you would have had otherwise. But of course, it's transformative agreements that make things difficult. If one journal's under a transformative agreement and therefore it's free in inverted commas to the author, but you're recommending a transfer to another journal that is not part of a transformative agreement and they do have to pay, that's when I could see that authors would get understandably annoyed.
Yeah, and I think more transformative agreements now include fully OA journals, so it's not that distinction between the hybrid and the golds, but that does still happen. That maybe it's a discount in the other one, and the first one would be fully covered. It does complicate everything, doesn't it?
Just to back up to the question you had flagged, Romy, about included a comment about, do you have KPIs for transfers? I could just elaborate a little bit there, that we do kind of set some internal benchmarks of what we're hoping for. And I think we use that less as a, kind of stick to beat our editors with and make them suggest transfers that are not useful or directly counter to what the author really should be doing, but just kind of to keep our eye on how can we continue to make the process easier? How can we make sure that editors have the information they need? It's kind of a carrot to keep us driving forward. So, yeah.
And is that something that you would make available to authors, like that kind of metric on, others have been in this situation, or for this portfolio of journals, this is the acceptance rate after the transfer, once you accept the transfer?
I'm sure there are reasons that we wouldn't do that, but none occurred to me offhand. Having more information for the authors seems like a good idea.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you need to think of it as a training tool for the editors, right? I mean, no one gets it right first time, and everyone can learn from past experience. And the KPIs within a team allow you to see which editors are behaving perhaps in the way you would like and you'd like to encourage, and some that perhaps are, you might want to change. But it definitely needs to be not a stick. It needs to be done in a way where, you're thinking about what's best for the author. How can we as a team create what's best for the author? And here's how we're doing as a group. And then also comparing those KPIs between journals within a portfolio as well. I think it needs to be done gently, but that you've got to know that. So
There's a comment from Poppy Pierce who's asking about whether anyone does anything to incentivize or gamify uptake from editors. I love that. What we,
I really hope not.
No.
No, I think we want to steer clear of that as much as possible. But I think there was another question about how do we get the editors and the editorial staff to think more critically about transfers as part of their role. And, one of the things that we do, when you do regular reporting to your editors, you give them statistics on their timeliness, how many manuscripts they handle. And we also have been including transfers that ultimately get published that they recommended, because I think that that is a good positive message to them, saying, right, you've made these recommendations, they did ultimately get published. And so that makes for more, it encourages them to continue doing it because they know the outcome is positive for the author, and that the editors of the receiving journal are also getting the added benefit of getting a paper that they want to publish. And so if you think about KPIs back to editors and how to encourage the transfer program, that's been working for us.
There's a lot of questions. Thank you so much, everyone. I'm struggling a little to keep up here. There's one from Henry about authors submitting to a portfolio rather than individual journals, and I think we talked about that already. It's a question from Jeff Lewandowski on, do any of the panelists have experience with authors who feel they may experience negative bias in the transfer process? If they see their colleagues have already rejected the article, so they would be rejected again. And would they prefer to do a fresh resubmission rather than a transfer? Any thoughts on that? What's the advantage of a transfer versus a fresh submission?
I think authors, sorry, Melissa, you go.
I was just going to say, for us, I mean, the editors will know either way because our system will show that this was a resubmission from another journal because our system is all connected. We haven't had, it actually is better if they go through the transfer because there can be some discussion about the paper and an agreement on the likelihood of it getting accepted somewhere else. So we haven't really heard of that, and the editors will find out anyway. And we have a couple of journals that have this sort of reject and resubmit, but we have a way to sort of flag that in the system and utilize those previous reviews if they exist to help inform what the next step would be for that paper.
Yeah, our system is a little different. We do have a question. If someone is submitting de novo, we have a question that asks them if they would like to reveal if the paper has been considered at another ACS journal. And in that case, if they say yes, the office administrators may ask, is it okay if we go and find out what happened there to help move things along? But, if someone feels like, yeah, that reviewer just was really off the mark and trying to address their concerns is not going to be productive, I think they should have the opportunity to just start fresh. And maybe that person wasn't the ideal expert, or maybe they were just grumpy that day, or who knows, that the referee, but not getting that paper kind of held hostage to someone seems like it shouldn't have to go to another publisher for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think authors worry about this a lot, but actually I think they worry needlessly. And I think most editors, if they're doing their job properly, and I think most editors do, they're willing to reconsider, if there's one referee report that isn't great, we'll find a new opinion potentially. I don't think there's any stigma of rejections, but I think authors think there are. And I think part of the problem is, we've just created a system where journals are black boxes, and most academics don't really understand what's going on, and different journals and different publishers do different things. And so people worry that they're going to be discriminated against. But in my experience, I just haven't seen it at all. I think editors have got open minds, but I'm sure it varies between portfolios.
I think you're right. It's a perception problem more than a real problem, but still authors may prefer to just leave that person in the past.
Yeah.
There was one question from an anonymous question about whether there should be 2 eyes on each reject and transfer. But then I guess if you open up, that, then there should also be 2 sets of eyes on, should this be published? And does it complicate things if we don't trust the person who makes that call?
I mean, I think editors, kind of following up on James's comment, I think editors are pretty thoughtful people. If they have any concerns about, am I making the right decision here, they will get feedback from a second person, or go ahead and assign it to the associate editor, and maybe they'll make a comment to them of, this seemed not great to me, but I need your eyes on it. The development editors that I mentioned earlier, for some of our very high volume journals where executive editors are having to triage a lot of papers, that's why we baked that into the pie, right? Is that they are PhD, someone asked, can I speak a little more about them? They are PhD trained scientists with their own expertise is related to the topical field of the journal that they're working at. And so they can do, they're not doing the full assessment that an editor would do, but as they're reading the paper to help kind of figure out its next destination, if they're reading and they're like, wait a minute, I think there could be really something here, they have the option to kind of kick it back into the system and say, can you take a second look? So we do have some safeguards built in.
So if we go back to the general topic of the webinar, how can we improve manuscript transfers for authors? One of the issues is obviously having to repeat things, the kind of technical aspect, the speed of things. What could we do to make, and we've talked a little bit of how we can make authors feel that that's the right decision by, you know, changing the language we use in the letters we send to them. But what could we do in terms of making that speed up the process? Do you have any suggestions, or how we could, you know, for all the people listening that it might want to follow?
For me, it's all about teamwork, right? So if you've got, by definition, if you have a cascade or transfer system, let's avoid the word cascade, but papers going between journals, the editors on those two journals need to know and understand each other, and as much as possible, and ideally collaborate on a paper. I mean, the ideal option is you know, let's say it's a desk reject. It's rejected by the donor journal, and the recipient editors have already seen it before the letter goes to the author saying, yes, we would be willing to peer review this. That is the ideal. Now, that's not easy to pull off, just from a logistics point of view, but it's all about teamwork. It's about trying to get editors to think as a collective across the portfolio of journals rather than for their individual journal, which is why I think this tension between you know, editorial independence, what's best for the journal versus what's best for the author, is something that's really worth exploring. Because I think sometimes we automatically think, well, editorial independence, you can't argue with that. That's just the way it has to be. But on the other hand, authors, we waste so much of their time by making them jump through hoops. So anything that we can do to try and help them, even within a portfolio, get published easily and quickly, we have a duty to do that as publishers, I would argue.
And how much do you think is related to the technical issues? If it was really quick, if it's just press a button to say, yep, okay, I'll transfer to the next journal. If it wasn't like having to go through the form again, would that
but what authors don't,
up?
It would, and I think that would happen within a portfolio because generally you tend to use the same system. But what an author doesn't want is to be rejected by journal B, click a button, journal A, click a button, go to journal B, get rejected there, go to journal C.
Yeah,
that's dreadful author service. Right. I mean, if they submit to one journal, ideally you want them to get to your best offer as a publisher as quickly as possible and with as little hassle as possible. And if they don't like it, they can walk away. But you know, reject, transfer is a dreadful author service.
Yeah.
And that's the bit that, you know, just everything needs to be set up so you avoid that.
It would be kind of helpful if when authors initially submitted their paper, we could ask them, you know, if it doesn't succeed here, where would you want to go? I suspect I suspect that authors feel so excited to be submitting to journal A, and they're like, of course it's going to succeed. It's my, you know, my work is amazing. I'm like wonderful. And they don't want to be thinking about the outcome of what if it's not going to make it here. So I don't know if that's a realistic suggestion, but it would be tremendously helpful if we knew these are my two next targets. Then we can go right to those editors and say, are you interested? And give the author some really meaningful feedback. But maybe that's a pipe dream.
We're going to try it, Catherine. And we'll let you know how it goes, because I think that I've spoken to some colleagues that there are some mixed reviews on whether or not at submission, you might get rejected. So where it's not a very positive thing to have to answer at the time of submission, but it's a very realistic question, right? Because most authors do experience rejection. And, you know, unless you're, you know, all of the papers that you're publishing are just top notch, I mean, you are going to get rejected. I think it's actually authors have accepted this transfer, and I think that they come to expect some sort of recommendation. And so why not just give them the option? And I think our editors would also be open to hearing, is there a journal they want to go to after us if we don't accept the paper? Because it could also help them. So we'll let you know how that experiment runs.
Fantastic. I also see a couple of people commenting that there are other publishers already doing this, so more to explore.
Yeah, I think we've touched on quite a lot of ideas and suggestions that might make the process easier for authors, and I'm afraid we're out of time. And thanks so much for all the questions. I will try and collate these and maybe get your input via panelists to help answer the remaining questions. If I know some of them we have actually talked about, and I think there's so many that people ask them again. So really appreciate your time today and all the suggestions, and I hope you find it useful. Some people have asked, the webinar has been recorded and will be available on the Kronos Hub website on the event page probably by tomorrow, and we'll also make the slides available, so please have a look there. If you've registered, we'll send an email out with that tomorrow, if not at latest on Monday, with all that information. If you want to be kept up to date with our upcoming events, we've got an event list, but also a general newsletter list. If you want to join one of them, if you haven't already, please go ahead. It's on our website, and you can up to date with other events coming up. Next webinar is on the 21st of March about author engagement outside of the publishing process, which should be an interesting discussion with different author experience initiatives that aren't directly publishing workflow related. So please sign up for that. And yeah, thank you so much to my speakers today. If you have any other final comments you'd like to make, and if not, I'll put your email addresses there as well for people to get in touch with you directly.
Just thanks, Romy, for bringing us all together. This has been really fun.
Good.
Yeah,
Thanks so much. Okay, well, any questions, please get in touch and I can forward it on as well. And thank you so much for taking the time today.